Hi, welcome to Technology Business Research. I'm Patrick Heffernan, and I'm joined by Allan, Krans, and we both run practices here at TBR, and increasingly, we're finding that the services practice and the cloud and software practice, we're working together. We're putting our research together, putting our analysis together, and that's really because of what the vendors that we cover have been doing and how much more important the ecosystem has been. That's pretty true, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what's really driving it is the focus on the end customer, that these aren't just technology implementations, they aren't just technology investments. They're meant to support business change, to deliver business value, and it's tough for any one vendor in the ecosystem, services or technology, to really do that just on their own.
Right, and I want to talk about the end of end-to-end in a minute, but from your perspective, looking at the cloud and software vendors, what's changed about how they think about partnering across the ecosystem?
Yeah, well, I think partnering has become a lot more important. Revenue growth rates have come down significantly for every cloud vendor that we cover. The demand for just migrating things to cloud to get cost savings, to get agility, has run its course a bit. And so the next phase of how do you sustain growth really gets back to what customers need in terms of business outcomes. And so they're not able to do that on their own. They have some level of services, but nothing like their partners in the services ecosystem can provide and have been providing for decades in terms of business consulting, implementation, and then support throughout that entire life cycle.
So one thing that's changed for the IT services vendors and the consultancies, and I'm curious how it looks from your view on the cloud and software side. Every single vendor operates from a fear that they're leaving money on the table. And every single vendor believes that they can do more so they can move up and down the stack in IT services. Every vendor believes they're end-to-end, which doesn't mean anything. But what it leads to is a lot of confusion in the market where you have vendors that are doing services that they're not necessarily known for, which makes it a more complicated ecosystem for the cloud and software vendors to actually evaluate, well, who really is good at this? Who is the best company I should be partnering with? And it sort of puts the burden on those vendors to actually know, what's the difference between the India-centric vendors individually? What's the difference between what a Deloitte can deliver and what Accenture can deliver? So how do cloud and software vendors make those distinctions? How do they know who to partner with?
Yeah, it's been a challenge, and certainly the scarcity of skills is bringing that into focus as well, where you can't have your number one trusted, relied on provider. They'll do everything for a certain number of customers, but for the rest of the market, they're going to need to pick a vendor that doesn't have the depth of case studies, doesn't have the depth of historic capabilities. So there is a little bit of risk reward going on in terms of trying out a new vendor, having some guardrails in place in terms of progression throughout the project, milestones, those types of things. But I think the lack of human skills has promoted some of that activity. And I don't want to bring up GenAI too quickly.
That was quick enough. Yep, there we are.
However, it is an area where if you can automate, if you can use intelligence that is scalable beyond just the bodies that are involved in these projects, that's really where it's solving a real need right now in terms of getting the skills and the competencies out there at scale to address what customers want to do and the number of customers that want to make some of these transformations.
Yeah, what you just said, there are two things in there, and on top of that GenAI, the competency and the at scale. And what we're seeing right now is that the burden is on the IT services vendors and the consultancies to actually make a convincing and a compelling case that they have competency around GenAI, which is a little hard to believe. It's a little early for that. And that they have scale, which is also hard to believe because it's kind of early for that. But the bigger picture is that what we've seen in the ecosystem is that the IT services vendors and the consultancies, they really do have the burden of making sure that an AWS or Microsoft Azure actually knows what the differences are. So it's not just the burden for those hyperscalers and the software players to distinguish. It's on the companies themselves to say, this is how we're different. This is how we're special. This is why a salesperson at AWS should say, hey, I really recommend this company over this company. In order to do that, they have to actually know what those differences are. And that's why every time I hear end-to-end, what you're basically saying is, I'm not giving you the cloud vendor, the software vendor, any reason to pick me. I'm just like everybody else, which is obviously not a good strategy.
Sure.
Despite the fact that we still hear it.
And same thing on the cloud side as well. It's not their technology, their solutions only take them so far in terms of these engagements. So the ecosystem around ISVs and those types of partners that are adding value on top of the platform. So the multi-partner go-to-market and ecosystem really is important from the technology side as well as the services side, because it's not going to be a single vendor on either of those spectrums.
Right, and to get back to what you said at the beginning, it's not going to be a single vendor in part because the customers themselves they're already working with partners. There's no sort of perfectly greenfield customer out there that isn't working with anybody yet. So if there's already a collection of companies that a customer is working with, then making sure that you fit within that ecosystem is super important. And it's the only way you're going to continue to grow within that customer, within that space. We have a recent white paper that's coming out that goes into a lot of this and talks about some of the challenges that we've seen the IT services vendors and consultancies running into as they're competing in the ecosystem. I know you had a chance to read it. Any thoughts on that? Anything I need to change before we publish it?
Yeah, I mean, I think just the complexity that we've gone through already. One of the main points of the paper is to focus on defining roles. Yeah. Who's going to do which activities in which context. Now, it's interesting. I'd like to understand more about the role that the customer, the cloud provider, the solution provider, and then the services partner, how do they actually define those roles?
So the straightforward, simplest answer is this. Who defines the roles owns the client. So it's not the client. The client's going to be happy to say, as long as you come in and bring me the technology, the transformation, the cost savings, all those things, as long as you're doing that, I'm happy. So the client doesn't need to care who's doing what as much as those people, the who's doing what, the ecosystem players, any one of them can be the one who defines the role. Now, so the big four firms will tell you that that's their sweet spot. They can orchestrate all that. Maybe. The hyperscalers can also tell you, hey, we're the ones that are actually driving this transformation. We're the ones that are actually providing the cost savings. So we're going to be able to define the roles. So at the end of the day, I think in any individual engagement, in any individual client, who defines the role will be who owns the client. And obviously that's where you want to be. That's the winning strategy, right? So It could be any of them. And I think one of the challenges is to make sure that you play nice in the ecosystem so that when it's your turn or when you are able to define the roles, then your ecosystem partners come along with you. And when it's your chance your role to be defined by one of your ecosystem partners, you deliver such that everybody's happy.
Yeah. And another interesting thing that came up in the paper was around the awareness of the ecosystem. Yeah. So in order to define the role, you got to understand where different players fit, where their legacy was in terms of strengths, where they want to go, because everyone is looking at this as an opportunity to grow and expand their addressable market in a number of different ways. What are some of the challenges to that awareness, and how can folks overcome it?
Yeah, well, that's exactly why we're collaborating more on our reports, because we have had traditionally at TBR, we've had these perfectly siloed reports where we look at Accenture in great detail and we look at AWS or SAP in great detail. So what we're doing now is saying, okay, what are the things that SAP needs to understand about where Accenture is and where they're moving? What is that? And that's probably a bad example. Those two companies know each other really well. But from the outside, what you need to do if you're trying to evaluate where a company is going and get that information, other than getting it from us, you really need to be able to go to your ecosystem partners and say, knowledge management, knowledge sharing, sales alignment. Alignment, and we've talked about this a lot, aligning your sales teams doesn't mean they're going to have the same incentives. That's just simply not going to happen. The incentives around selling software is different than the incentives around selling services. So understanding that is important, but aligning how you're going to market, how you see the client, and it's back to how you see each other's roles. That's where sales alignment can come together. And it's like Jimi Hendrix, are you experienced? Are you aligned? That's really, truly what it comes down to. So alignment is key, knowledge management is key, and having clearly defined roles, totally key.
Right.
Yeah. Well, if you have other questions on this, please reach out to us. We have a cloud ecosystem market landscape that captures the 3 cloud hyperscalers and 10 of their SI, 10 to be expanded to 12, I think, of their SI and consulting partners. We have a federal cloud ecosystem, market landscape or ecosystem report. We have more reports coming out that are blending the two practices that we have, the services side and the software and cloud side. So if you have extra questions, send them to us. Thanks, Allan.
Great, thanks.
Thanks.